Hello and welcome back to take two of this episode of the War Report. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, which we will not get into, but fear not, we have both survived so far. We have neither succumbed to this. I know it's been over a week since we put out an episode, but scheduling conflicts. Yeah, you know how it is. Even though nowadays, I imagine those are few and far between. But there's some people in the world that still, life is functioning as I guess say normal. But we will not get into that. We will get right into our news on Syria. So it looks like some of this program's predictions are coming true, and that things are really heating up. So not so much in Idlib this time around. There's been some news out of Idlib, but we'll come back to that. There's been skirmishes in southern Syria. You can see with the green pocket of rebels near the Jordanian and Iraqi borders. That's been picking up. The small contingent of U.S. forces still in the country have been engaging quote unquote ISIS targets. Now, whether those are ISIS targets or whatever, uh, I do not know. It could be anything. U.S. patrols still haven't fared any better. They've been turned around, harassed, whatever. Uh, and what has really been happening now is the quote unquote moderate rebels, especially in Idlib, have been turning on each other. In fact, one of them actually got into a firefight with Turkey. So the coalition against Assad and its state backers, it seems to be crumbling before our very eyes. Now, I expected the opposite out of this. I mean, I knew there'd be escalation. It was kind of hard not to see. But I would have expected a more solidified front and a last ditch effort. But it seems like the pressure is actually forcing them to turn on each other, which I imagine has been the Russian and Syrian strategy as we've seen at previous times in the war, such as Aleppo, such as all these, just entire journey north. That's been their strategy to sort of have these groups turn against each other because there's so many small differences that they're willing to kill each other over. But it looks like that is happening now. But I figured at least with Turkey they would be able to whip them into shape. But it seems like that's far from the case when they're actually being antagonistic towards Turkish forces.
Right, and I would argue that the small jihadi groups that are still inside Idlib ultimately know that they're the most important asset that both the U.S. and Turkey have. Ultimately, without like them leaving, literally means that there's no reason for America to be there unless you're saying that America should be there to protect the Kurds from the Turks. But then that's quite a contradiction. So ultimately, the small jihadi contingents. I mean, they're not that small. They're fairly numerous, and they've just finished a new campaign to recruit a new recruitment campaign. Even the so-called red band suicide bombers that have joined the ranks. Uh, Ultimately, they know they're the most important element in Syria right now, and that without them, there's really no reason for Turkey and America to be in Syria, without, of course, having to tell the truth. Um, so I would say that this is the card they're playing. They know that, I mean, in a way, they know that they can bitch slap Turkey from time to time, and Turkey cannot retaliate against them. I mean, Turkey has never retaliated against them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
So,
it's again their last ditch, and Turkey. They would walk on hot coals for the opportunity to get shot at by their moderate rebels at this point.
yeah. So, I mean, I'm not saying that Turkey isn't divided. The government is divided on this issue, and I believe 2 shows or 3 shows back, we talked about that.
Yeah, the
So their
brawl in
parliament is
Parliament.
divided. Yes, yes, and that was quite a row. Now, um, so it's not like the situation it can go on indefinitely, even though it sometimes feels like it actually can. Um, but I would say that it's going to. I mean, all things considered, there's more stress now than there was a year ago. There's more external pressures on Turkey, and they have to make good. The fact is that patrolling the M4 highway is a loss. It's a net loss for the jihadis. Not so much for Turkey. So Turkey's objectives in Syria are a little different than their jihadi forces, but the jihadis need this. If they could, they would completely take over all of Syria if that were possible. However, they can't, and they won't, and so they're forced to even Idlib. Idlib is something that is compromised, and I think that's what's fueling the anger. Is that the situation is untenable as long as especially as long as there are Russian patrols going along the M4 highway, and these are limited. We've discussed this before. They go in and around Sarakip. They've made some longer ones, I believe, today or yesterday, but essentially, they can't get this off the ground. But they know that eventually they will have to, and if they don't, then escalation is going to increase. The important thing to remember that the situation as it stands now is becoming intolerable for the jihadis. And they need, what they want is the territory that they lost in February. And unfortunately, that's not on the cards for them. But something also really interesting happened just today with respect to Syria. And this is in the Deir ez-Zor region. So, violence has blown up there for the last 2-3 weeks. 6 Syrian soldiers were killed. Several were injured in that area by ISIS attacks. But there is a U.S.-backed sort of jihadi group, a terrorist group in that region. And they go by the name of, I'm probably going to butcher this, but Maguire al-Twara.
I didn't know they were recruiting Irish jihadis now.
Yes, that's right. Is this the IRA? Isn't this just the IRA? Anyhow, so...
Oh, Al-Hawadi.
That's right. So they surrendered to the Syrian army. And 9 vehicles were captured. These are basically, from what I've seen in the photos, they're pickup trucks. They're pickup trucks with some ammunitions mounted, some not. Some are just for transport. But grenade launchers, small missiles, 7,000 rounds, and all these and their machine guns are literally all American.
How did that happen? It just must be the military equipment Obama left behind in Iraq. No other ulterior motives. Definitely not provided to them courtesy of the United States. It was simply just a mistake and mismanagement of American war making in the region. No other explanation at all. Anything else is a conspiracy that I will not tolerate on the show or in the chat. So be warned.
Yes, behave, guys. So what had happened was they'd given up, and they'd not only given up, but they actually mentioned that the U.S. had asked them to attack Syrian forces and even stage terrorist attacks, according to them. So you might think, well, this is a lie. It's bogus. Well, after surrendering to the Syrians and the groups sort of coordinating into one group, this is that pocket that you were talking about in eastern Syria on the border with Iraq. The Americans fired and destroyed 3 vehicles. It's like it's the meme of that boy who's so angry in class and his veins are popping from his forehead. Like, bro, chill out. American media is not going to publish this.
You haven't contradict yourself in Syria in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
So I mean that's a pretty big coup. That was a really interesting development. The other thing involves an ISIS commander. Apparently, Tal Abyad went under Turkish protection. So, it's hard to choose who's more lenient on these groups in Syria. So yeah, there's no real effort on Turkey to stem back the influence of al-Sham and ISIS and these other smaller factions like the Turkmens in Idlib. I mean, if Turkey had its way, of course, they wouldn't be confined to like controlling this tiny stretch of highway that with all these people whose relatives are living as refugees in Syria.
So, how much of this do you think is American pressure on Turkey? I know we implemented the sanctions on Turkey about 3 weeks, a month ago. Those finally took force, and it seems like they've been rather, I would say, pussyfooting around their deals with Russia and the Syrian government ever since.
Yeah, I think pressure is going to increase. Um, you get the feeling that America cannot afford to lose in Syria, and I think some of that is real, and I think some of that is symbolic.
Yeah, I think it
And
boils down entirely to credibility. I mean, when it comes to the oil and stuff, I mean, we don't need the little oil Syria produces. When it comes to the pipelines, that went out the window, I would say, in 2016, 2017. Ever since Assad, the war really started going Assad's direction. And at this point, I think it's purely for the appearance of the credibility and competence of American foreign policy. Because if look, I mean, everyone knows it has failed, but if the United States admits it has failed in Syria, this would be the first regime change war they've really had to run with their tail between their legs. I would say since what, Vietnam.
yeah, I mean, it would be interesting if they did decide to sue for peace. Like, what would that peace look like? Now, I don't see any effort whatsoever on
We're
their
gonna withdraw,
part.
but Damascus has to have a pride parade.
Yes. That's gonna be that's in the deal. That's like unironically in the deal.
Well, they know
we'll
loophole Syrian pride. Oh, how about that? Assad wins
Syrian
again.
pride, but it's pro Assad gay couples. So yeah, I mean, I don't see any effort. I think America like feels like any inch that's given, like, and in a sense, they can't offer a deal because this was supposed to happen. The CIA instituted, Arab Spring, which like, literally failed, which was essentially to prop up, it was to get rid of like former Ba'athist and Ba'athist sympathetic or ex-Ba'athist sympathetic, leaders and so on. And basically, reinstate the other sort of soft power, sometimes hard power hegemon of, oh God, now I just had a brain fart. The Muslim Brotherhood. So, Egypt has flipped between these two several times, but essentially the Muslim Brotherhood's power is in Turkey and has been for a very long time. And so that's what that power play was about. And, it didn't generally work out. And like, even where it did work out, Libya, for example, it's not really working out. There's a war there. And essentially, people have figured out in Europe and abroad, in the West, that's amongst the other continents and nations in the world, that essentially getting rid of Gaddafi was, in the end, very bad for Europe.
I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up because even the most hubristic of neoliberals, I mean, Obama said that his biggest mistake was not having a plan for what happens after Gaddafi. Now, he didn't outright say intervening in Libya was a mistake, but he admitted that the way he went about it was a mistake, which is the most you're going to get out of these people.
It's so pathetic. Imagine like the night before the attack. This is what we're going to do, guys. What do we do after? I don't know. Just attack. Like it's so ridiculous. As if that's believable. As if it's believable that you actually go into a war, but you don't know what happens after you get rid of the leader. I mean, obviously Obama's lying.
It's as if chaos was the plan all along. Hmm.
Yeah, yes, exactly, right. Um, so yeah, that's not turning out. So to bringing it back to Syria, I think America is expecting Russia actually to sue for peace and ask for negotiations and so on. America isn't. America, I think is determined to. I've said it before. They're determined to stay there as long as it's necessary to turn Syria essentially into another Libya with no port for the Russian Navy. Not that that port's really great. It's not. It needs a tremendous amount of work. It cannot, at the moment, service the kind of large ships, partly also because America would block them from doing so. But even that is too much for the U.S. Like even the fact that Russia can't have the its military, its naval military present there is something that isn't part of Russia containment. At this point in time, Sevastopol was supposed to have a NATO base, and that was in 2014, 2015. But this is 2020, and that's not the case.
Yeah, well, we'll actually get into some of the Crimea stuff in relation to U.S.-Chinese relations, which, well, we're
Yeah.
gonna do that more towards the tail end of the show. But yeah, just put a bookmark in that because, I mean, yeah, it is amazing that they've cast everything into Syria more so than any other project in the, I would say, since probably Iraq and arguably even more than Iraq. I know like there was more direct U.S. involvement, more open U.S. involvement, I should say. But what's going to happen now? Like I've said this many times before, and I'll say it again because repetition is key. There may at some point be an official U.S. withdrawal where troops actually do come home and the American presence is out of Syria, but the country is still going to be crawling with mercenaries who are aligned with the United States or some United States interests, or there's private contractors defending these oil fields. Who do they work for? It's probably the United States or a Western power. So they're going to do that until they absolutely cannot, and they're not going to do the formal withdrawal until they absolutely have to and hand it off to the more shadowy management of Syria, as it were.
Mm,
But just to close out the topic, you know what happened about this time a week ago? You know what we got news reports of?
mm.
It's April, and the smell of sarin is in the air.
Oh yes, that's right. The report has come out. The report has come out, but there's some other things that have developed since then. Besides I forget their alphabet name. Um,
HTS.
yes,
So,
I'm leading it. Flopping.
what our good friends over in Hayat Tir Al Sham saying? Of course, not our good friends, but just good friends of the United States foreign policy establishment.
Well, I mean, I guess I thought you were going to bring up how Assad is literally infecting Idlib with COVID-19.
Look, that hasn't happened yet, but there's strong suspicion to believe from our sources that he may.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah. So the that latest report. So there was a row in the UN over this. With the European powers, again, they're not going to let go. Like there's no bargaining. They're just in a weak period, and they want Assad gone. They want this, the last remnant of him, and because it's the only kind of sort of resistance there is to the U.S., Israeli, Saudi power bloc, and if we exclude Iran, but Iran would have no reach if Syria were gone.
Absolutely. But yeah, I can look when when the virus reaches Idlib, they're going to find a way to blame it on Assad, even if not saying outright he dropped
Yeah.
barrels full of it. They're going to say, oh, well, his forces are doing nothing to contain the spread of it, blah, 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 blah. And I can almost guarantee you they're going to go with that line at some point in this.
Yeah, yeah. Because actually, the Chinese flew in some relief, and if the Chinese are flying in with relief, then it's this is the kind of stuff that works.
Yeah,
So
oh, yeah,
just letting you.
absolutely. uh, but in all seriousness, they tried to push this narrative. It didn't even last a day. Now, you recall, they did this last year trying to drum up anti-Syrian sentiment, drum up some support for some limited U.S. intervention. That lasted a couple days. This didn't even last a day. It was there and gone.
Yeah,
Uh, the mainstream media didn't pick up on it. It's just not popular. We've gone over this. People did not care 2, 3, 4 years ago, and they're definitely not going to care with everything going on now. But I just thought it was funny because I knew that they would be dumb enough to push it. Now, they didn't push it as hard as I was expecting, but I knew they'd be dumb enough to, just keep on going with it. Now, the question is, will they even bother with this in April 2021?
yeah. Hard to say, right? Because they didn't actually bomb anything.
Exactly.
All they did was try to. um, yeah, it's almost sad watching them still peddle the story. After all these leaks, like the first time around of that 2018 report back in 2019, there were inconsistencies with it, and then that was leaked, and when they tried to smooth that over and say that the report is still basically valid, then another leak near the end of 2019 leaked out saying that actually, no, that's not true. It's not a valid report, and there's no evidence. And so now, of course, they've restructured it to say, we believe there's evidence that at some time in the course of the war, Assad has gassed his own people, which is it's extremely vague, and all you're basically saying is there's enough evidence that I could believe it. I can't prove it, but I can believe it.
Yeah, it's like, well,
And so
oh, you can't disprove it. One of those kind of arguments.
yeah, it's childish. Like, you're right, and you've mentioned this before that so far they haven't struck Damascus. They haven't fired any missiles at the U.S. I mean, um,
And Israel hasn't because it turns out international flights are on a bit of a downturn. There's not much cover to use.
yeah,
Yes, I'm recycling your joke, and I have no shame about it.
COVID COVID-19 has been a disaster for the state of Israel.
COVID-19 is anti-Zionist.
Yes. It's the most anti-Semitic virus ever. So yeah, they can't hide behind civilian transport planes. It's so very sad, and it's becoming easier to detect them and to intercept their missiles. Like a recent one on the border with Lebanon, I believe. It's one of those where one side claims a Hezbollah leader was killed. I believe the news out of Qatar was that he had been killed. Well, of course they'd love that, but what I saw coming out of Syria and Lebanon was that he escaped. That there was a missile that was shot, which had missed, and the people in the car, including this leader, ran out, and the second shot hit the car, but there was no one in it, or at least the leader wasn't in it. In any case, this will be a story that will just essentially disappear.
Yeah.
In less than 24 hours, it won't matter at all. Even if they got him, it's not going to matter because he's not a high-profile leader to begin with.
Oh yeah. It's not like it was Nasrallah or anything. Like, come on.
Yeah,
Well, we are pushing
yeah,
that. We are pushing the half-hour mark, so I think we should probably wrap it up on Syria.
yeah. We should. Boy, these guys love Syria. Yeah, let's go on to the next subject, definitely.
So Russia and the oil wars. Now I'll start with Russia, and that'll get us into some of their budgetary problems into the oil negotiations. So you have Russian experts saying they may be on the brink of a New York style outbreak in Moscow. Now, it seems like they've caught this ahead of time. This is more like a precautionary warning saying if we don't do something, that's what will turn out. Not this is inevitably going to turn out this way. Uh, April, so about 14 more days, 2 more weeks, is still a month long paid vacation for all non essential Russian workers. Putin announced that at the beginning of the month, end of last month. So it seems like they're on a pretty solid lockdown, and they seem to have their plans together in terms of keeping the country locked down and really preventing the spread of this. And their numbers, at least what they've reported, and I don't think that the Russians are malicious enough to lie. Like again, I don't attribute the same sort of secretiveness and the insular culture that I do to the Chinese. Not that it doesn't exist, but definitely to much less of a degree. And what we're looking at now is it seems like they have it pretty well under control, but they're fearing that the worst is yet to come, which I think is a pretty common sentiment amongst most nations at this point. And the oil wars have actually taken a toll on their budget. Now, the Western media, a lot of the anti Russia elements will have you believe that this is the absolute implosion of the Russian economy, that they're going to default next week and they're just going to come crawling to the West, begging for the removal of sanctions, giving up Crimea. They're trying to spin that narrative. Look, pretty much, even though nobody has admitted it yet, we're in a global recession. Things are going to be hard for everyone. Everyone is going to need to tighten their belts, and everyone is going into the red to some degree. Russia has been preparing for this for a while. Their economic growth hasn't been the best pretty much ever since 2014. They've had budgetary problems, but ultimately this is something they planned for. They used the upswing of that around 2016 through 2018 when their economy started to get back on track, really recover from the sanctions and the recession, to prepare for the next one. Since again, like some countries, and unfortunately the West doesn't have any of those countries, have the foresight to see that economic growth is not a permanent thing, that we need to plan for the future. And not some far off future, but the future a few years down the road. So I'm not saying the Russians are going to be uh, like on top of the world during this or just carrying on just fine. I'm not saying there would be any issues at all with Russia. But it seems like out of everyone, they are best prepared to run in the red for a while. I think their emergency funds that they built up still have some in it. I think that can still last them a few years, depending on how much they have to spend on emergency medical aid or other emergency things with emergency paid leave. Again, that's all up in the air. I think all of us know at this point, especially doing the show and watching the show for however long, that just one unexpected thing can throw everything through a loop and completely destroy any previous plans you had. But it seems like, yeah, pretty much everyone's going to be running in the red. The Russians are no exception, but they have a plan to have it not be an absolute disaster.
Right, and the OPEC deal, basically what it's suggesting is that at first they're going to have like they say 10%, but it's actually a 14% cut in total production. So 10% might be just in what is sold or given. Then that's going to, from July to December, that's going to increase to minus 18%, and later on it could be as much as 23. But again, this depends largely on how COVID develops throughout the world, and it may be that Russia will at one point or another say, F this, and produce the oil anyways. You hear the stories that that they're running out of places to store it. I generally believe that. The truth is, you can't lock down the entire economy of the West. Developed nations strong nations, economically speaking, are the ones that are going to be hit by this the most. Uh, Russia is more of a developing economy. It's a developing economy. It's not going to get hit as hard. And like you say, they've been prepared since 2014 to 2016 when Saudi Arabia tried the same trick, essentially by reducing prices. And Russia, since then, by the skin of its teeth, escaped that. And now they have a surplus. They have about $110 billion. In rubles, that's a lot. And that's what will probably get them to weather this better. From the various sources that I've read, speculation is that Saudi Arabia can't take much more of this, to say nothing of the American shale industry, which now this assumption that 50% of it is like it's over. I mean, just the U.S. alone right now is at 22 million job loss claimants. So, like Russia is essentially betting that the West is going to have to open up its economies.
Yeah.
And they're slowly doing that.
Yeah. And I do have to say, because, again, the narrative from a lot of the Western media is, we've seen this so many times in the past, this is the end for Putin. Has he finally screwed the pooch this time, as it were? And
Yeah.
ultimately, I can say I don't think that's the case. Number one, I think he's survived much worse. 2011, 2012 was not a pretty time for Russia, even before Crimea. Like, there were times when his support was much lower among the public. But let's assume that, okay, maybe this is the end, and they storm him out of office, and he's forced to resign or whatever, and go into exile in I don't know, China or wherever. I have a hard time believing a liberal Democrat would be a person who succeeds him, and not. I mean, you think Putin's an evil dictator? You should wait until it happens when you radicalize the Russian population.
Right. In any case, it's the West that's teetering more than Russia is right now, especially with regards to the EU. Brussels published a formal apology to Italy for "quote unquote" not being there. Let's not forget that all these countries have very small militaries and that depend very, very heavily on America for protection. And America depends on them for a certain amount of like military-based extortion, basically where they always have a constant
protection in exchange for loyalty, as it were.
Yeah. Yes.
A very feudal system, except like with none of the cool parts.
Yeah. Imagine feudal Europe, but gay. So yeah, I think. I mean, a lot. Like again, I think Russia will come out of this okay. It's probably going to be turbulent, but there's a sense, I think, from speaking to friends in Russia, that this is more of, it's not. Although they sense that the West is against them, and especially America, they sense that this is, a troubled time basically for the whole planet, in that everyone is suffering to some degree because of it. So, yeah, I mean, Russia doesn't have 22 million job losses, and there aren't like people with "Don't Tread on Me" flags going to state capitals saying, we want to be out in the streets and so on. And then, and I don't necessarily blame them. Michigan, you can't go to your cottage, but you can go to your cottage if your cottage is in a different state.
Yeah, like again, it's sort of like how like the West takes all the cool parts away from authoritarianism, but keeps all the bad parts.
Yeah. So, yeah, I would say that it's still kind of early in the game. Prices for oil are slowly creeping back up. They're still way below, but shale can't last at $40 a barrel. It has to be up in excess of $50 a barrel, and which I think suits certain big oil companies just fine, and these are American oil companies that will just gobble them up. Um, but then you have to ask yourself, like, how profitable will it be for them? How much of the hemorrhage can they tackle? Certainly more than these small companies that are producing American shale. The one thing I worry about is like, is America going to cut back? Like, um, I don't see figures for America cutting back in its production. Um, I haven't seen any report. So if that's the case, I don't know how long Russia is going to be able to tolerate that kind of environment. Um, I just haven't seen it. I'm not saying it's not out there, but literally all the stuff I find on oil cuts, it's basically Russia and Saudi Arabia are cutting back 50% of the grand total because they're the biggest producers, and then you have the smaller countries like Qatar and so on, who are also cutting back, and even Mexico. But there is a truth. There is a truce that Macron has suggested. He wants a truce. He's Napoleonic, but like with a diplomatic flair. Um, the article is ridiculous because really a truce for what? Like, is there an unofficial war that we don't know about? I mean, everybody knows there is an unofficial war going on, but you don't really see the evidence for that stopping.
Yeah, and I'm actually gonna get into some of the French stuff later, but yeah, South Front. They put out a good piece today. You can check out. It's called "The Kremlin: The Awakening." Lays out some of the programs Russia's gonna put in place for payments to small businesses, employees, and just sort of the response that they've been taking. And this is from April 15th, so yesterday for us, 2 days ago for those of you listening on the live premiere. So I'll try to link that so you can check that out if you want to. But it is interesting because France, it seems like their infection rates have spiked. It's really made their way to them, and as you said, Macron wants to call like the truce, as you put it, for the again the sort of shadow war that we all knew was happening, but none of them would admit was happening. But
Yeah.
in all of this, I do think we've noticed a trend. We've pointed out especially in Europe, a lot of the right wing populists have effectively capitalized on this in terms of calling out mass migration and globalism as a whole. A survey from the French population, it was something along the lines of it was in French. I had somebody else translate it for me. 3 out of 4 people in France see no benefit from Europe. Was the survey,
Mhm.
and it is interesting because they've sort of taken up the mantle of being the head of Europe ever since Merkel pretty much announced she would be stepping down in 2021, which is just shy of a year away. I think September 2021 are the next German elections.
Yeah, yeah.
And
That's right.
that's assuming her health holds out. I mean, I know there were some problems with her before, or with how chaotic things have been lately. Uh, an early election could be forced in Germany. There are parliamentary systems; very easy to force an early election. Now, I don't know how likely that would be to happen, but I know that the opposition party has been winning state level elections, especially in southern and eastern Germany. Not so much western and northern Germany. Funny how that works out. But it seems like again, we've covered this probably in the past 3, 4 episodes, that this idea of a European unity, of a European brotherhood, well, we're all going to help each other out. We're going to be economically integrated. It's going to be like we're all like just one people, has completely come apart at the seams. And the people who have admitted it are vindicated, and the people who've just come around to that uh, are starting to realize the people that they would have denounced as racist or xenophobic or backwards or just afraid of further integration, it seems like they're kind of coming around, and that really the dedicated suicidally ideological liberals are the only people who haven't admitted this yet.
Right. You have like this story, which has been very popular the last 4 or 5 years. Well, especially the last 5 years of Europe becoming, or more and more Europeans becoming frustrated with migration, especially economic migration, and also with refugees for that matter. And as it stands right now, 2020 is not going to be a great year, and discussions about bringing in more refugees or even prolonging the war in Syria or
Expanding membership to other states, especially in the Balkans, talk of that has completely died off.
yeah, to use a COVID term, it is non-essential. It, these are all
Sorry, Albania,
very
you're
non
non-essential.
yeah, these are very non-essential arguments, and they know that. So that is one front that I think globalist elites are going to have a very difficult time dealing with. And on another scale, I guess we'll talk about China later, but um, you know, you have a lot of these smaller countries that have a lot of finance a lot of Chinese finances invested in those countries, and in as much as they fear China, they also need China. And you have countries like Australia, for instance, and they want to have a market, a manufacturing sector to return. I don't know how great or large Australia's manufacturing center was, say, in comparison to the U.S. It is a smaller country, and it's a very different country. But nonetheless, they're talking about that, and that's another issue that's essentially makes elites very uncomfortable, because ultimately what that would mean is higher prices. And that dynamic that was created or began in the 1970s with China, where you could have very cheap manufacturing and relatively high prices, though you're told that prices would be much, much higher if we don't use countries like China and India, but especially China. But I kind of doubt that, because the fact is, if nobody can afford it, it's not really a world that a lot of them would want. Why? Because it would reduce the middle class. And so there would be an entire class of highly aspirational people that would be reduced in numbers. And the fact is, the kind of economy and the kind of prosperity that the West has enjoyed, and there's several countries, but especially America, I don't know how comfortable they would be in that environment. So that's what it would do. It would have essentially sacrificed the middle class, and then you'd have like these big, black markets, and you'd have these fine goods that only a relatively few number of people could afford. And it would be difficult for a middle class to emerge. So it is a very difficult situation, and a lot of it is, it's based on greed. In the same way that the stimulus package by Trump, they're already saying that 350 billion is already almost dried up for small businesses. So, I mean, you have another economic crisis of just 12 years later, after 2008, and you have very large corporations taking advantage of it, which I mean, we all expected that to happen.
Oh yeah, absolutely, vulture capitalism at its finest. But you bring up a good point, and I'm not sure whether it was intentional or unintentional, because I honestly don't know if the elites would be intelligent enough to think of something like this. But really, there is a dead hand switch for a quote unquote divorce with China, where, yeah, if you pull that plug, it is going to be painful not only for the elites, but for the people of the nation. And yeah, it's going to rile them up, and they're going to point the finger at you. As much as you may try to point it in any other direction, whether no matter who else you blame, it's going to fall on the feet of the ruling class. And it is an interesting point, but like I said, I'm not sure whether that was just something that developed inadvertently, or whether that's something they kind of planned out, which we're going to get again into the U.S. China relationship and sort of the deterioration of that over the past 5, 6 years in a couple minutes here. But yeah, it is. It has created an interesting dynamic for the West, where and again, like I can't think of any a more appropriate time to use the expression "rock and hard place."
Hmm.
And I do want to take the show in a little bit of a different direction for a couple minutes here because I like to throw in some of the more humorous stories every once in a while, and this one fits the bill. 13-year-old leads neo-Nazi group linked to terror plots in Vegas, which was one of the targets listed. Now, this 13-year-old boy was an Estonian, and he led an international neo-Nazi group. Apparently, yeah, I guess the CIA is getting desperate. They're recruiting teenagers to do their dirty work, and the specific reason I say this because when the story also came out of Finland, because again it was a group with international ties, like actually had terror plots in the U.S. Now how serious those were, who knows? I probably wouldn't put too much stock into it, but when you get these kind of groups in the Baltic states, in Finland, and Ukraine, they're almost always 99 times out of 100 backed by the CIA or State Department or Pentagon or any of these groups because they're willing to play on nationalistic sentiments if it can be redirected against the Russians.
Yes.
Yeah, they don't care if you
Right.
put on your SS uniforms and march around in Riga or anywhere else in the Baltics, not Balkans. Oh boy, that's a
Yeah.
I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. But yeah, any like or Ukraine's a good example, even though they've recently turned on their the sort of neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. But it is an interesting dynamic, and the fact that again it was just some like 13-year-old kid sort of just how there's no way there isn't something more to this story that somebody was propping this up and it's so embarrassing that it was led by a teenager.
Yes. It's so desperate.
Yeah. I for one
Yeah.
thought the civilized world outlawed child soldiers, but apparently not. Oh no, are the Baltic states civilized? That's a debate I'm not getting into. I know we have a very diverse audience. I don't really want to start any ethnic conflicts in the chat or just among my audience in general. So, but I had to briefly touch on that story because I just thought it was
Yeah.
entertaining.
It's bizarre. It's way out there.
Yeah, it's on the same
I'd
level
never
as
heard.
the Italian neo Nazis who had the stolen missile and tried to assassinate Salvini.
Yeah.
That it's the same kind of story there.
Yeah. I mean, we've discussed this before. Like a lot of these countries, everyone from not that Romania is woefully egregious, but uh, a lot of these Eastern European countries, they're allowed to have a little sort of base pseudo-Nazism because it acts as a bulwark against the Russians. And if they were anywhere west of Poland, of course, that wouldn't be tolerated. So, I mean, we all know how this works.
Yeah, and they're already like sort of putting the pressure on Poland, at least some of the more liberal elements in the West.
Well, after Tiger King, that there could be a marriage of like baseness and basically the U.S. mandate to legalize gay marriage everywhere.
Oh yeah, homofascism. Who doesn't love it?
Yeah, like yeah, there you go.
Yeah, but just for the contrast, Hungary, a country that's been conciliatory towards Russia, gets no sympathy whatsoever.
Yeah,
So, yeah, just keep that little contrast in mind. But I figured I would bring that up. But moving on to I guess what you could say is sort of the big topic of the show, and that is what we've been hyping throughout it: the U.S. China divorce. Now, as we discussed, it was sort of with Nixon and Mao, the reestablishing of relations between the U.S. and China in the 1970s led to a relationship that exploited the ideological and geopolitical splits between Russia and the Soviet Union, China and the Soviet Union, and ultimately led to the Soviet Union's downfall and the West's quote unquote victory in the Cold War. And that relationship persisted after the Cold War with a high degree of economic integration, interdependence, with countless industries moving offshore to China, with uh, billions, if not trillions, of dollars of trade being done with China, with East Asia in general. And that was a comfortable arrangement for, I don't know, about 40 years or so. I think Nixon's
Mm.
visit was 73, Crimea was 2014. So, yeah, a good 40, 41 years that arrangement worked out through thick and thin, through the Iraq War, through Afghanistan, through all these American foreign policy blunders. China was more than happy to continue economic integration and being part of the broader liberal empire as a manufacturing hub. And they got the skim technology off the top here and there. They've become so efficient at skimming technology. Apparently, they're now funding jihadi groups. But yeah, we might get into that later. But it's that's another story in and of itself. But uh, yeah, they got the skim technology and knockoff technology, and it was a pretty comfortable situation. The growth of the Chinese middle class skyrocketed. The growth of the Chinese economy skyrocketed, and it was a very very beneficial relationship for the elites of both countries. Uh, and then a certain madman in Moscow uh,
Yeah.
took some unprecedented actions in 2014, and Crimea all of a sudden was back in Russian control, and NATO didn't get its access to those nice Black Sea ports, and they didn't get the chance to deprive Russia of their crown jewel. And lo and behold,
Right.
we saw the gradual process of China, especially with Xi Jinping, who I believe came to power in 2015, towards the tail end of the Obama administration, sort of make his moves to consolidate power and move to realign his country. Now, look, regardless of your thoughts on China, on Xi Jinping, and I'm not even saying it's been fully done yet. You have to admit it's impressive the fact that such a massive shift has made so much progress in what 6 years, 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, if anything, once 2020 is done with, you know, I mean, we all know that everyone's economies will have slowed down. Russia will most likely avoid the liquidities problem that it faced in 2014 and 2016. It will probably take a hit, but China probably will not take a massive hit. I think it will be a stall from the projections I'm seeing from the IMF. And we take these with a grain of salt, but um, generally speaking, they probably won't be hurt as badly. Um, so I think in many ways, like as you say, in 2014, Russia, in a sense, impressed China as a valuable partner, and China since then has worked for even more integration with Russia, and their goals many times overlap, and sometimes they don't. However, generally speaking, they do depend on each other, and to a great extent, I would say that in some ways, Russia relies on China more than the other way around. But nonetheless, keeping Crimea in Russia's hands essentially means Russia shielding China, because if Russia falls, China doesn't stand a chance, because it can be sequestered from virtually every angle. It's asserted itself in the South China Sea. It's asserted itself in the South Pacific and in the Indian Ocean.
But yeah, but
None of those
they've done
things are
nothing on the scale of Crimea.
right. But what I'm saying is, as much progress as they've made in the and is it, you call it the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific realm of trade. The truth is, one of the reasons they can focus on that is they share this border with Russia, and from whom they don't have to be afraid of being compromised.
Yeah, and
So
yeah,
that's an
I was
enormous
more
benefit.
so
While they're not, sorry, go on.
yeah, I was more so bolstering your point with the fact that China hasn't done anything to the level of Crimea. That yeah, the shift is still underway, and
Oh, I see.
it does show some like something of a reliance that they still view them as a I would say a senior partner militarily at least.
Yeah, I would think so. Um, and at the moment, like most European countries, their greatest trade partner is still China. But I think going forward, you know, even if things go back to normal, I think that this is going to have a lasting effect. That is, I brought up earlier about the situation in Asia with regards to China. There are going to be countries there that are going to be much more hesitant. Jinping and Abe were supposed to meet. They've had several summits. That has been canceled, and a greater amount of mistrust has occurred. Uh, Japan has tried. Japan has to walk this like very delicate road between what America wants for Japan, especially with who its partners are, and with what Japan feels it needs to do to navigate that area. Japan, just you could argue, still depends on American aid for to guarantee military security. However, I think we're going to see Japan wanting to act um, more independently, and I would look for them trying to have some kind of a delicate balance between partnerships like the Philippines, Vietnam, etc., and maybe going as far as India as well. But at the same time, not to make China feel threatened. Now, there's also that with Europe. There, I suppose, are going to be initiatives because of the sense of kind of weakness that COVID has brought about. In a way, it's shown the ineffectualness of a lot of European nations, especially a lot of EU nations. And so, how are they going to, navigate the same kind of course of depending for military security from the U.S. at the same time trying to instigate something that is beneficial for them, because after all, they have to live there, and sometimes this does, these projects don't always agree with the U.S. More often they do, though. So I think China is going to be looked at with suspicion, and um, it's going to be those countries with the heaviest amount of investments with China that are, I think, going to have the most difficult time. One of the things that China depends on is that a lot of these countries that have a lot of Chinese investments, their countries on a sociological level are very unstable countries, and so they also depend on China rebounding economically and being able to fulfill its role, so to speak, because factories are not going to leave there in the immediate future. That could take decades, and I think this is one of the reasons why China has essentially developed parallel technologies. Yeah, some of it is stolen, um, but I mean, China isn't doing anything that's like immensely egregious that the British and the Americans didn't do in the 19th century. So
Yeah, I'm just saying if you fear an imperialistic China, the worst is yet to come. If I mean if you think they're going that direction, this is not the extent it's going to be. And yeah, that's what I can say. And so far, again, they're just sort of being uh, I would say merchant nation just trying to accumulate wealth as it is now, whether that be through debt traps or whatever. Again, they're at the point where they're just trying to resource gather. They haven't really begun their expansion now. To what level they actually do want to expand, again, that's a question for a different day. But I do think you make a good point about Japan. I think I wouldn't necessarily call it an imperial drive, but I do think Japan still has a desire to be the top dog in Asia, as it was for many years, even post World War II, when it had the second largest economy in the world before it was overtaken by the Chinese. I still think there's a desire from the Japanese to do that and be more than just an American military base. And
Yeah,
I could see a situation where as the United States, especially the population, becomes more and more weary of foreign involvement, that they sort of pass off some of the, I guess, say, imperial responsibilities on Japan, which, again, may lead to conflict, sort of what we see with Turkey, where they hand it off because they can't manage it themselves, and then they start contradicting American interests.
right. And you know, one of the sort of troubling signs of a nation is when tourism becomes a very big industry, and Japan is no exception. They've seen a 58% drop in tourism in the first quarter of 2020, and their biggest tourists are actually Chinese.
Yeah,
So that's really to put into perspective. China does not depend on tourists in the way that Japan does, and I think this is why Japan wants to create more meaningful relationships with the surrounding countries and tread this line between the U.S. and China, because in a way, being under American hegemony for all this time and watching China increase and prosper and go from like literally like very much in a much more successful way than the USSR went, or the Russian Empire went, from this largely agrarian society with 85% of its businesses owned by foreigners, um, to essentially everything was nationalized. It came at enormous costs from the war and from the system itself. And in the end, it didn't pan out. And but I'm going off topic. But the thing is, you know, I think Japan, on some level, feels like it has had to play second fiddle to China because of the U.S. and it has not been able to kind of forge its own future in a way that it needs to in order to be an important power in the Northeast Asia, something that it's been used to being for at least the last 300-400 years.
so
So they can't afford to become even more dependent on the U.S., I guess is what I'm saying. And for them to do that, they have to break away from the U.S. as well and not be swallowed up by China as well.
yeah, and
And
I
this
expect a big
conundrum that exists in Europe as well.
yeah. I expect a big push against Article 9 in Japan, which is sort of their treaty that bars military buildup or waging an offensive war. I expect that to grow very unpopular in Japan, and I also see something happening. I wouldn't say it's an apt comparison, but the closest thing I can think of, I think Japan will try to become the Turkey of East Asia as it is.
I think that's a very good point, especially with respect to what's going on now. Because, yeah, I mean, you have the MAGAPEDs and the conservatives basically trying to blame this whole thing on China. Like, okay, it came out of a Chinese lab that America paid money to as well.
Yeah. I mean,
Then
if
you have
anything,
these.
it's a condemnation of globalism, and I mean, look, not that China is
Yeah,
complicit in it, but again, there were French investment in it, there was American investment in it. It's
right.
and as it goes back to what I was saying before, and what we'll probably touch on briefly before moving on to this topic. It's the wedding of the Chinese elite to the Western neoliberal elite. There's plenty of people in the Chinese Communist Party who would love it if Xi Jinping just disappeared tomorrow and they could put another quote unquote pro Western leader in power that would continue the pre 2014 status quo. Now, that isn't going to happen. I think things have moved too far ever since Xi Jinping sort of took over like the dictatorial powers, as it were. But I'm sure there are plenty of people. I'm sure when he leaves power, I know he's up there in age. That I'm sure there will be a push from some elements in the Chinese Communist Party to want reintegration with the West. Now, especially at that point, I think it'll be too far gone. But still,
Yeah, yeah, we shouldn't forget that. I mean, all countries have their own fifth column, as it were.
yeah, and yeah, the Japanese, I think they're actually in a prime position to sort of play the U.S. and China against each other and reap the benefits. Now, I don't think they'll be as brazen, as bold as the Turks. It's just
No.
in doing it. I mean, just down to cultural differences. But I mean, a lot of people are thinking Japan and China hate each other. This would never happen. I mean, yeah, okay. There's a lot of historical animosity. You know what other two countries have a lot of historical animosity?
No, go ahead. I'm
Turkey and
dying to
Russia.
hear it. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
one of history's greatest rivalries, at least in my opinion. And if they can put that aside for geopolitical expediency, I don't see why China and Japan can't. And I have a feeling it's going to be a bad decade for the Korean Peninsula if it's going to be if that's going to be the
Yeah.
dynamic for East Asia. I have a feeling that any hopes of Korean unity or sovereignty or any deal between North and South Korea, it's either going to accelerate it or completely destroy the idea, which I'm leaning towards the latter in that case. But yeah, Japan is in probably one of the best positions it could be in terms of the global order.
Right. Go if it acts wisely.
Yeah, and I give some credit to Abe. I think he might. I think he, out of anyone who had the foresight, I'm not too keyed into Japanese internal politics, but I mean, he's had meetings with Xi Jinping. He's had meetings with Putin. He isn't ideologically or geopolitically committed to the quote unquote American empire, as it were. He's also had good relations with Trump. So I think from my limited knowledge about him, I think he's pragmatic enough to be able to play the great powers against each other.
Yes.
Now, the last topic I want to do is completely unrelated to pretty much any of the topics we did, and uh, I can't remember whether we really addressed this. I know we probably mentioned it in passing, but Biden is our 2020 Democratic nominee. He will be going up against Trump in November. Now, the election for a while there sort of took the back seat because of everything else going on. Even to the national media took the back seat. It was sort of Trump versus the virus. But a question I want to pose to you and to our audience is what we have here is we have a guy who just can't stop running his mouth no matter what, and who says things he's not supposed to, that he knows he's not supposed to, but ultimately hasn't really taken any substantial policy change. Now, that, of course, is Donald Trump. Yeah, I mean, but just his rhetoric alone, just the fact that what he represents is more frightening than what he actually has done in office. So there's that. People make the argument like, yeah, he's sold out, which I would admit, yeah, he's sold out. He's completely compromised. But still, what he represents is something they fear. Biden, on the other hand, is a lifelong establishment politician who has completely lost his marbles and also says things he's not supposed to, but is more inadvertent about it. But the thing is, he's also much easier to control. Not that Trump is some sort of maverick, but he has his moments of rebellion sometimes. Even even in 2019, 2020, when I thought he had been fully subdued, every once in a while he'll come out with something that is heresy to neoliberalism. Whereas, again, you have Biden who's completely lost his marbles, but ultimately easier to control, easier to feed a script. So I posed the question to you and to the audience: who is the chaos candidate? Donald Trump or Joe Biden?
I honestly think Biden. Hold on. I honestly think Biden is more capable of like making one big like he could have a succession of like five good decisions. Of course, that other people would make. Then he would intervene and like say something dumb. I do think there are people in the West, like in America specifically, who like think like after Trump in office, there's a babbling guy. Is he really that bad if the decision making is better? In a way, like I guess what they're asking is, has the world accepted the absolute state of America right now? And I think so. I think in a serious way, that's the way they're looking at it. But I still think that Trump is the chaos candidate primarily because I think conservatives will look at Biden and just say he's loopy, he's getting old, obviously, right? In which case it could be something like America won't unify, but it'll be pacified. Let's just say that, right? But we'll call it unified for now. And I think with Trump, again, it's not really anything he does, but it's more about what he represents on a primordial level. Like, yeah, there is, and it's not always that. There have been. I mean, just the way he's handled coronavirus has been so bad. Like, there is fair criticism originating from people I don't like that I have to admit is actually fair and honest, like with less spin than normal. Uh, but that said, yeah, I mean, he really affects people in a primordial way because, in a sense, right, for good or for bad, whether he makes decisions like, I don't know, like, um, I'm going to legalize gay marriage all over the world. No matter how many concessions he makes, like, it's never good enough. And why? Well, because I mean, there's a reason why, say, he appeals to conservatives no matter what. It's because he represents a kind of man that really should have been extinct at this point. Certainly not in power, even if it's largely optical. But there is some decision making that a president has. And, like, it's just not supposed to look this way. This kind of person should never have risen to the top. He should not be there.
He's much
And
like
so I
yeah,
think,
he's much too brazen, especially compared to people like Bush and Obama, who both tried like we're just good old humble boys, leading this empire with a great amount of brevity and the respect which a great powerful institution deserves. Whereas Trump is annoying as can get. Like, I don't care. I'm not apologizing. You're wrong. I'm right. No, I didn't say that. You said that sort of attitude.
yes. So, I mean, it basically has to deal with, like, the evolution of the West from the Enlightenment onwards. And, of course, one day it was going to evolve with these megalopolises within each of the countries into a kind of, managerial technocratic society, given the way things were going. So Trump represents something from, like, the era, that kind of transitional era between, like, the strong man and the beginning of the managerial order of power. And, for 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 women, for other, and for certain minorities, gender minorities, he's terrifying because he represents, this, like, bad dad, this, like, scary authoritarian dad. This is why you'll never convince them that he's not an authoritarian, no matter how much evidence you pile on. They're reacting to him emotionally, symbolically. They're not reacting to him, like, factually. Like, so they feel like, all of this can go at any point, and it's this that I think drives the chaos.
Yeah,
Even
he's
more so than, like, it makes America look bad. Because the truth is, they would settle for Biden as president. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but they would settle for that, and it would look as ridiculous.
yeah. Trump, like you said, is a subversion of sort of the linear idea of history. We had the first black president. Now the women and the transgenders and the whoever need their political representation. They need their turn at the seat of the empire. Whereas, again, as I said, like people like Clinton, Bush, Obama, were very, I guess, quote unquote humble, at least acted humble, and
Mhm.
acted like they were above it all and like treated like with the great respect to the office, that sort of thing. Whereas again, Trump sort of reverted back to the strong man uh, sort of persona, and ultimately, I think both of them are chaos candidates insofar as the American empire in terms of what we just laid out for Trump. But for Biden, even though he may be controlled, like you said, it takes one slip for him to completely give away the game. And it also, even if they can completely rein in Biden, completely control him, and it's just small slips like where he forget when he forgets what he is or forget what he's saying or tells like calls somebody the wrong name or something. Uh, what that also represents to the world at large, to our quote unquote European allies, to the American liberal elite, is that we're so desperate. We nominated a 77-year-old senile old man to be president because we feared a, uh, a loudmouth celebrity billionaire that much.
Right, right. So it gives you a sense of how just desperate the situation is.
Yeah, uh, but in short, both of them are uh, chaos candidates.
Yeah, yeah, and ultimately, yeah, what you said is the main point that literally these are the only candidates that can be produced. Of course, there could be other candidates, but we're talking about a system that ensures these other candidates could not possibly enter the White House. So, you know, I suppose we should also talk about Bernie. Bernie is formally withdrawn and has endorsed Biden. I mean, there were some people way back in 2016 that always thought he was a fraud, anyways. Not that stupid. Oh, he's just a commie, and like, oh my, like as if. Um, he's a neoliberal, y'all. Like,
Yeah.
he's just a
He's a
different kind of.
welfarist neoliberal who came from a hippie background where he was like, oh, that communism stuff's cool, like that's that sort of background. He's no
Yeah,
Vladimir Lenin who was sent in from outside of the country to destroy it. Like, yeah, I might
yeah, yeah.
actually respect him if he had that will to power, but he doesn't.
No, and everybody knows that that one moment when those large black women climbed onto the stage, onto a stage, and basically took over. It became their stage, and I mean that was obvious then. And so he has bowed out, and essentially, and just like Tulsi Gabbard, I mean, she essentially said that I'm going to support whoever wins. So, I mean, people were pissed that she supported Joe Biden, but she did say all along that that's what she was going to do. So, yeah. So, the system ensures that people like Tulsi or whatever that have some new ideas, or even Yang, that those ideas are kind of meshed and grafted onto the mainstream, because essentially those ideas, what they do is signal basically kind of like where the empire is, and how maybe at this point in time America cannot afford to have this kind of very predatory capitalism, and something has to be done about it because people are literally struggling. So those ideas are grafted on, but it's understandable why the system wouldn't want any dramatic changes, though it espouses towards dramatic changes and so on. But yeah, which one would be by margin Trump, but largely it reflects the kind of chaos that the U.S. is in.
Yeah, and let me just end the show with this. Look, we'll be the first to call out Trump's acquiescence to the neocons or the Zionist lobby or any of these things. I think we've been very critical of him on the show, and I think it's all been fair criticism. But I will support him because I wouldn't say support, but I will give a soft amount of support to him because number one, he's the chaos candidate. Number two, like it doesn't really make that much of a difference, and at that point, like he's entertaining and he gets off the leash sometimes, and ultimately, the world we see today, a lot of the collapsing of liberalism in Europe, in Asia, um, the growing influence of Russia and the European populists is maybe not thanks to his policy, but his existence, thanks to Trump.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I'm sorry, but a handshake photo with Netanyahu isn't going to make me write off the guy. A lot of other things are, but that's not going to do it in for me when even just inadvertently he's shaking things up so much too. Such a um, decrepit and rotten world order that look, I'm going to tolerate some things. I'm not necessarily going to consider myself a Trump supporter or be like, oh yeah, MAGA, COG, whatever the slogan is now. But ultimately, I appreciate that someone like him can get in office even if he doesn't do anything substantial because it's just a testament to how vulnerable the system is.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I mean, he he's an accelerationist element, even when he tries not to be. Um, so yeah, you know, because of the way people act, and in a very primordial way with who's ever leading the country and what they represent. At this moment in time in American history, basically one side, if they don't have their guy president, they will feel oppressed. Um, Neither side will be happy, and I don't foresee anything that's going to unify America.
Oh, I do. And
Even even Sleepy Joe.
I do, and I think this will be a good way to close out the show. The one thing that can unify America is a Biden Trump ticket.
Yeah. How awesome would that be?
One struggle. I can tell you, we're looking at the downfall of the West. What's going to happen is, uh, look, Putin. He's going to get Ukraine. He's going to get Belarus. He's going to get all these things. In response to that, it's going to be like in World War II when the British formed a liberal conservative unity government. Biden and Trump are going to unify into one ticket, and to top it all off, Macron will declare himself Emperor of Europe. And he'll preside over a brief golden age before it all comes tumbling down. That's an official
Yeah.
war report prediction. You can take that one to the bank, and I don't look. If you wanted to debunk me on that, feel free to, but I think you're going to have a bit of a hard time proving all that wrong. Or at least I hope that's what happens. But I think we covered everything.
Yeah, I think that's all for me right now.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to this very eventful episode of the War Report. Hopefully these keep on happening. I'm glad we finally got to discuss something else. For once, the majority of the show wasn't dedicated to the elephant in the room, and it was nice to get a break from that. And a lot of important shifts happening right now, and
Mhm.
it's wild to see. And I can only see things just again. I think it's a bit of a momentum. The faster it goes, it causes it to go even faster, and it's quite literally acceleration.
Yes.
So thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of the War Report. Thank you again for the support of the show in general, and we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Thanks, guys.